She is the author of the Wayward Spy trilogy, including The Wayward Spy, winner of the Independent Publisher Book Award Gold Medal for Suspense Thriller, and a 2021 Top 12 Book of the Year from Strand Magazine, The Wayward Assassin and The Wayward Target. Her books draw heavily on her academic studies of international relations and Russian language and culture, both at Harvard University and Boston University. Susan worked as an intelligence analyst at the CIA, where she earned a commendation for her work. Subsequently, she worked on Capitol Hill as a professional staff member for the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. She later worked as a government contractor and freelance researcher, analyzing terrorism and weapons of mass destruction. Since her stint on Capitol Hill, she's worked for several federal consulting firms. Susan lives with her family on a farm outside of Washington, D.C. She's currently working on her next book, a standalone psychological thriller set in the world of D.C. politics. Welcome, Susan.
Thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
And wow, what a bio. And I think we had to cut it down a little, but you have such an incredible background, and I just have a ton of questions. So Greg, I don't know if you want to start us off. I've got a whole page here. Sure.
Well, I was just going to say, being that the one of the themes on Imposter Hour is imposter syndrome, I'm always, when I see a bio like that, I'm always sort of intimidated myself, and then my imposter syndrome kicks in. And then B, I sort of wonder to myself, how does someone who's this sort of decorated, wading in the same kind of waters with that as I am? So I don't know, maybe if we could just kind of jump into it that way.
Yeah.
I'm also feeling like an imposter sitting here with two best-selling authors. There we go. I think we're on equal footing.
Okay. Yes.
But yeah, I mean, I can talk about my background and how I got into the world of intelligence and how I often felt like an imposter.
That would be amazing.
All right. So let's see. I was, as a child, I wanted to be Nancy Drew. I think that's kind of a common thing you hear among mystery and thriller writers, especially females. And, I used to kind of try to keep track of the comings and goings in my neighborhood. And I grew up in a very peaceful suburban area near Cape Cod, so nothing ever really happened. One neighbor's flowers were cut late at night in her garden, so I was on the case. I don't think I ever solved it. So I moved from Nancy Drew to Agatha Christie, and then on to Tom Clancy. And that's when I thought, these books are, these are keeping me up at night reading. I wonder if I could do something like this. Nothing came of it. I just read lots of thrillers, Nelson DeMille, Tom Clancy, some of the old school thriller writers. And then when I went to college, I had always been fascinated by the Soviet Union and communism in general, just in terms of the Cold War. That's when I grew up. It was the us versus them mentality and the evil empire and all that. So I took some Russian. I did a lot of Russian and Soviet history classes, U.S.-Russian relations. And I thought, I would love to work for the CIA. I don't want to be a detective. I want to work for the CIA. And I saw an ad in the newspaper for a government job fair way back when, before there were online job boards and things. And one of the agencies that was going to be there in Boston was the CIA. So I typed up my resume and went to the job fair and found the representative and said, I want to work for the agency. What do I need to do? And they told me about their student programs, which they still have to this day for college and graduate school students. And so I knew what I had to do. It was about almost a year-long process between the beginning application, the background check, polygraphs, physicals, all of that sort of thing. So it took me almost a year to get into the program. And that's how the Intel part of my life began. And probably my first instance of true imposter syndrome was my first day on the job. So the agency, they didn't have me make coffee or run copies. I walked into my office. I had my own office, which was kind of amazing. and there were top secret documents just sitting on my desk. And I remember looking around thinking, am I supposed to touch these? Why are these on my desk? They say top secret in bold letters across. And so I thought there's got to be a mistake. What? So then I remember reading the documents and thinking, why are these so top secret? But I learned over time. So that was probably my first instance. And it took a while. I'm walking down the halls wondering who these other people were. I'm with a bunch of analysts. They're all introverts. Nobody really talks to anybody else. So I'm wondering, are these the spies? Is that why they're not talking to me? What is going on here? And so for me, it was great fun because I had thought about what it would be like to work for the CIA for a long time. And then I had a kind of a big imposter syndrome moment when I was working. There was an international crisis and they were looking for volunteers to work overnight to monitor events and, brief the teams when they came in the morning about what happened overnight. And that was classified. So I volunteered to do it because I was young. I didn't have a family. Yay, stay up all night and then I can sleep all day. And so I'm in my office and I don't know, maybe 5 o'clock in the morning, I hear a phone ringing somewhere out in the kind of general cubicle area. It's ringing and ringing. So I said, where is everybody? I wasn't the only one there. Maybe they were getting coffee, whatever. So I went out and picked up the phone and it was the CIA director calling into our office to see what had happened overnight. And my first instinct was, I can't talk to him. I have to hang up. This is not... I can't do this. Who am I? I'm an imposter. Thankfully, I didn't hang up, and he turned out to be very gracious. And to whom am I speaking? And I explained that I was part of the overnight shift. And well, what's gone on? And he was calling on a secure line, and so I gave him a quick update. And he's like, "Fantastic! We'll see you all later this morning." And I go back to my office and I'm kind of shaking. And I think my boss came in early. I don't think she was working the overnight shift. And I said, the director just called and I talked to him and she went ashen. Like, what did you say to him? So it turned out to be okay. I mean, I reported the facts, but boy, that was a moment that I thought, this is just wild, absolutely wild. And then I think the third instance at the agency that jumps out at me was I was assigned after the collapse of the Soviet Union, different countries that came out as independent nations after the Soviet Union collapsed. And so I had an assignment of several of these little stands and whatnot. And there was upheaval in most of them, but there was upheaval in particular in one of these countries. And it was of significant interest to the United States. And I said, well, here's what I think is going to happen. The leader of country X is not going to stand for what was going on. So they said, well, this is going to be important. You need to write this up for the president's daily brief. And I was like, what? I still had about 3 months under my belt as an official intelligence analyst.
Wow.
So I wrote up this little piece and then I had to defend it sort of up the chain. So I think I ended up talking to my boss's boss and having to defend my position before it went into the president's daily brief. And that was terrifying as well. I felt confident that I was coming to the right conclusion, but I was terrified that I wasn't at the same time because I'm trying to predict human nature. But I had an abundance of evidence. And so it went through to the president. And thankfully, the next day, what I had predicted would happen happened. Yes. So yes, lots of imposter syndrome. They really, and part of it was because I was not thrown into the fire. The fire happened a couple months later when world events kind of blew up. No wars or anything, but a significant event in the early 90s that you might be able to figure out given my interest in the Soviet Union. Yeah, that was sort of a baptism by fire at the CIA.
Wow. There are so many things that you've already touched upon that are sort of art imitating life, imitating art, imitating life. To start off with that, the second story you told about that phone call, for the listeners out there, part of, Susan, the way you came into our orbit is our mutual friend, John Payne, who's a wonderful novelist. And that actually mirrors very closely a plot point in his book of someone sort of answering this phone call that then sets quite a chain of events in motion. So that's very interesting. The other part that I think is fascinating that I'd love to know more about, you mentioned growing up when you did in that Cold War era, and then getting interested in Nancy Drew and Agatha Christie and those kind of mystery stories, and then that bringing you sort of eventually back around. So that's a little bit of a chicken egg situation as well. I wonder, looking back now, is there anything maybe about the political climate that you grew up in that maybe brought you into the headspace of being a mystery reader to begin with, and then launched you, into the career?
Yeah, I think I always liked puzzles. When I grew up, there was not social media, there was not really cable TV, and I had one of those Gen X childhoods where you went out on your bike and your parents assumed you'd come home around dinner time kind of thing. I had a friend who was nearby who loved to, she wanted to do the spy thing too. And so we would have fun kind of sneaking around the neighborhood and just being silly. And then, I do remember when Reagan was shot, and that was shocking to me. I was in school when they announced it, and I thought, well, what is going on? I'm not sure if I was aware that, Kennedy had been shot and died. I don't remember what my awareness of that. I wasn't alive when that happened, but like historically, I was pretty young when Reagan was shot, so I didn't have any frame of reference for it. So then I kind of became interested in him. Mm-hmm. And, I distinctly remember the evil empire and, all of these very old Soviet leaders, like, who are these people and why are we afraid of them? And I wanted to learn more. And at some point I started reading up on the KGB. There must've been a book in the library. So it really drew me in, and and of course Gorbachev coming into office, there was optimism, but there was drama and tension, and what's going to happen between the United States and the Soviet Union. I remember the invasion of Afghanistan by the Soviets. Talk about full circle. I don't really recall what I thought, but my news source was either the Boston Globe or whatever news channel my parents were watching that night. So it was pretty limited. But then I read 1984 in high school. And that I have to credit that and a teacher with really pulling me into just wondering, how do people live under that kind of system? I mean, I grew up in the United States, and never would occur to me that anybody would inform on me, or, that there could be a knock on the door, all the stereotypical stuff that did happen, probably not as broadly as the movies portrayed. But, and then I had an English teacher who, she did a unit on Russian literature. And so we read Chekhov and, Solzhenitsyn on it. And I was just, I just had such an affinity for all things Russian culture as well. So it was a mix of what I was exposed to through media, my imagination, books, and school. And that's what kind of pulled me in. And it just never went away. It always stuck with me. I even had a professor in graduate school who was a former, their version of the KGB, I think it was the STB, who he was a intelligence operative in the Czechoslovakia, and he defected. And I just couldn't ask him enough questions about what his life was like and what it was like since he came to the United States. And so I kind of felt like destiny that I was getting pulled toward the intelligence world, because I just I was fascinated by every facet of it, especially if it involved the Soviet Union. I didn't find China as interesting, although, they've had more staying power in terms of the political system.
Right.
Well, when you talk about the stakes that surrounded the three kind of imposter syndrome moments, I just keep thinking that unlike so many other people, with your job, it really was life and death to an extent. So the pressure is so great. I mean, it seems natural that you would feel imposter syndrome. And I'm also really struck by the kind of constellation of interests that brought you to this line of work. And you mentioned quite a few books. I mean, clearly you're a reader and a lover of stories. So when you actually arrived in this industry, did your real life experiences square up with the things you had read about, or were there big differences?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, I'd like to say that I was sort of Jack Ryan because he was an intelligence analyst, not an operative. But I think the books, including my own, are much more adventurous and daring do. After a while, it becomes kind of routine to go into your office and turn on the computer and have to go through just, loads and loads of documents that are coming from our embassies, from our case officers, from satellite intel, and it becomes routine and nothing's really, so the sparkle sort of wears off. It's still really interesting, but it becomes routine. And, you try not to write routine parts of your job, whether you're a detective or, a CIA officer, into your novels, because nobody wants to read about that. Like, I came in, the coffee was awful, and absolutely nothing was happening in my country. So I sat there all day and, wrote this long-term, if there's nothing going on in your countries, you have to write these longer papers about broader trends. And, there's sort of background information and they're important, but it's not nearly as fun as having to write something for the president. That's a lot more interesting and it excites. That's the adrenaline rush.
Sure. The stakes. You mentioned a few minutes ago about a piece of your job being centering around trying to predict human nature, which I think translates pretty naturally to, what we do as writers. Were there ways that you could talk about how you kind of extrapolated a bit of job A into then job B in that sense?
Yeah, I think so. I think I've always been pretty good at putting myself in other people's shoes, and I think most readers are, most writers are like that. Yeah. Whether the character's fictional or not, there was, I'm not sure if there still is, an office at the CIA that I thought, well, I wouldn't mind doing a rotation there. That it was the Office of Leadership Analysis, and they were the ones who followed every single move that foreign leaders of interest made: their health, their psychological state, their family life, their education, their childhood upbringing, to really try to understand who these people are and what makes them tick. So I consumed some of that information when I was at the agency, which helped. But I also did some of it myself, just in my day-to-day job, trying to find out as much as I could about certain leaders to try to figure out what they might do. And it wasn't, my conclusions on some of the things I wrote weren't entirely based on these kinds of assumptions, educated assumptions. It was also based on, public statements they made, bits of intelligence we knew about what they were saying to their military, that sort of thing. So it's all source analysis. That's what they call it for a reason, because you're basing your conclusions on all kinds of sources. And the things that I would write that would, you kind of had to footnote everything. So you might say, we're aware that country X's military is moving over here or testing out a new weapon. And you would cite that depending on what type of intelligence, whether that was a human source or satellite eavesdropping, you would have to cite your source. If it was something like, this leader is prone to, not listening to his, subordinates on issue X. well, that's probably based on human sources, but it's also, if it's a broad enough conclusion, they would call it BNI, which I think is, BNA, background and analysis. So you kind of accumulate this body of knowledge about these people, and it becomes background information. It's like somebody you know how they're going to respond in most situations, 90% of the time. Mm-hmm. So with characters in books, I definitely had to, figure out who these people are, where they came from, what motivates them, their background, their loves, their hates, their fears. And I find it's most fun to do that with the quote unquote bad guys in my books. Okay. It's really fun to get into their heads and figure out what makes them tick.
Do you approach a bad guy character, quote unquote, differently than you would the protagonist, for instance? Are there any tricks or, adjustments?
I think it's the same process for me. Mm-hmm. It just takes longer to figure out what makes the bad guys tick, because, to be transparent, the main character, my protagonist, is based off of my early career. So it's like, I already know her. She's from Boston. She loves the Red Sox. So it kind of goes off the rails. Our life experiences diverge basically in chapter 2 of the first book. But I still know how she will react to things, because I think, well, what would I do? So, but yeah, the villains in the books, and even some of the secondary characters who maybe aren't bad guys, but I find them really interesting and fun. I enjoy putting together their life and making sure they're not one-dimensional. There's nothing worse than a one-dimensional antagonist who, is just bad because they're bad. That's just so fun.
Well, you answered one of my main questions about your protagonist, Maggie Jenkins, who appears in all 3 of your books. She's the central figure, and I was wondering how much of yourself is in her. I mean, this is always a fear I have as a novelist, that people are going to assume that I'm all of my characters, especially when I'm writing villains. So it sounds like you've selected certain aspects of your life, but obviously the things like your fiance being assassinated is not true to your life, and other details like that. That also makes me wonder, at what point in your career did you decide, I'm going to start writing? I'm going to write novels about this.
It had been on my mind for years. I'd say from late high school onward, but I don't know how to write a book. How do you write a book? I don't even know. I was a voracious reader, so I think that helped. It wasn't really until when I was working on Capitol Hill, this was after the CIA, and I was working for the House Intelligence Oversight Committee. The HIPC is the acronym. And the HIPC is located in the attic of the Capitol, which is a super cool location. I thought, I love those super cool locations. So there's sort of this side elevator that most people don't really know is there in the Capitol. It's visible, but most people don't notice it. And you take it up to the attic of the Capitol. There's a Capitol Hill police officer there. He's armed, there's a couple different secure facilities up there. There's no windows. It's right, if you think of the Capitol building and the dome where all the pretty windows and glasses are, there's this kind of a layer that runs around, and that's where the Intelligence Committee spaces are. So what a great job that was. I had a lot of fun. I like jobs where I have fun, which writing is one of them. It was just a lot of fun. But no job is 100% fun. And the not fun part was the budget process, because again, here comes the imposter syndrome. I get a stack of CBJBs, Congressional Budget Justification books for a whole bunch of agencies, 8-10 inches high, sitting on my desk. And I'm supposed to go through those and decide what programs need more funding and what needs to be cut and what's duplicated. Talk about imposter syndrome. But that's what the staff does. And then they present this to the congressmen and women on the committee, and it goes from there. So there'd be times when I'd be just looking at these budget books and my mind would start to wander. And I think, well, it's too bad I don't have a book. I should write a book. What would it be about? And when I worked on Capitol Hill, it's kind of where I lost my idealism about, yay, democracy. I mean, we have a wonderful representative republic. Some of the people I encountered on Capitol Hill, I thought, how did they get here? And why are they still here? And so I thought, well, maybe the only way these people would ever not get reelected if it was a massive scandal. And that's what started my thinking for this book, that there was somebody, a member of Congress, who was involved in something nefarious for their own personal gain that posed a threat to the United States national security. And here's this poor Capitol Hill staffer named Maggie who stumbles on it. So that was way back in late 90s, but I didn't actually start writing it until 2001. And so I started the book then. My original villain was a guy named Osama bin Laden. And then most people who really paid attention to the news would know he was the one behind Khobar Tower bombings and those sort of things. The average American probably never heard of him. So I thought, well, this is great. I got the villain. Yep. And then 9/11 happened and I said, he's out. I mean, he's obliquely referenced because how do you write a terrorism thriller from the early 2000s without referencing him? And that's where I ended up creating Zara as the antagonist, as one. She grows in importance. Well, I don't want to give no spoilers, but I think that worked out. It wasn't my intention to have Maggie kind of going up against kind of the mirror image of herself as but on the bad guy female side, but it worked out. So, so years and years and years of thinking about it, not doing anything, and then getting ideas when I'm staring at budget books on Capitol Hill, and then finally started writing it. And it was from when I started it to when it got published, it was 20 years. I wasn't working on it, obviously, continuously, but I went through a couple agents. We didn't get it published and put it away for years and said, I tried. I'm not going to keep at it. And then I'd pull it back out again.
So it kept,
because I was an imposter.
Sure, of course, as we all are, but it kept kind of pulling you back in. It kept nipping at your heels a bit.
Yes, definitely. I couldn't let it go, even though I swore to at least 4 or 5 times. Sure.
I wonder. I don't know if you watched the television series Veep when that was on TV. Julia Louis-Dreyfus plays the vice president. It was an HBO series from the early kind of 2000s, I guess it ran. It ran for a number of seasons. But an interesting thing is I remember listening to her talking in an interview when they were saying when they finally wrapped the show up a couple seasons ago, part of what I think prompted them to do so is that the world of politics, the show largely is satirical in tone. And one of the things she said is it became harder and harder to write satire as the actual government was becoming more and more satirical. And I wonder, in your position, having worked in the field for as long as you did, and then going into writing, do you ever run into that situation where the fact is actually crazier than fiction? Is it ever something like that where you think anything you could write might not actually live up to the wildness?
Yeah, yes, and I see that in other books that I read too. I'm like, well, I just read that in a book, and now it's happening. There are a couple of events recently, and it's less the absurd as an echo from my books. When after the attack in Israel on October 7th, it was a couple months later. I think it was an El Al flight landed in. Oh, come on! It's in my third book. Not Abkhazia, one of these Russian republics. I can say the capital name, but it's really hard to say. It's something like Makala. It's in Dagestan. I'm not going to try to say the capital name. And so I'm watching on Twitter or X, and just seeing some of the footage where some of these locals like storm the airport. Let's get the passengers. It was really terribly frightening. And I'm like, oh, I've been to that airport. And I was like, wait a second. I have never been to that airport, but it's in my third book. And I researched the heck out of it on the internet. So it's like, I knew what it looked like. And it was just this weird, surreal moment of, I feel like I've been there, but I haven't been there. And now there's this kind of riot going on at this airport in a place nobody's ever heard of. And it's in my book. So and that's what I mean. It like echoes into the present sometimes. So, yeah. But I mean,
you have been there, but in your head.
In my head, and thankfully for the internet. I mean, a lot of the places I write about, I have been asked, well, how much time did you spend in Russia? And that's, oh my gosh, I'm such an imposter. I haven't been there yet. It's one of my goals, one of my bucket list items, but I'm not obviously going anytime soon. Not with Putin in power. It just doesn't seem like a fun vacation.
No. Well, you mentioned earlier in the conversation, as a child, you were very interested in puzzles, and a lot of that ends up being pattern recognition. And I have to imagine working in the job that you did and seeing, getting all of this intel ahead of the general public and so forth, you're probably seeing things, and you're at a certain point probably able to discern patterns, and it must almost feel very prescient to be able to think ahead to like, okay, this is probably, there's a strong likelihood something like this may go down in the next, X number of years, and then almost to be able to kind of predict it.
Yes. That has happened to me multiple times, and it's not, anyone can say, well, I knew that was going to happen. And I don't like to be like, well, I really knew that was going to happen. Right. Here's an example, like everyone's saying, oh, Putin he's got this and that disease. This was when he first invaded Ukraine, and he may be sick. He may, he's not going to do this if XYZ happens. And no, you don't know. Not that I know him. I'm not trying to pump myself up, but you have to know him. You can't put an American lens on a foreign leader and decide, well, he'll never do that. And I also was like, he's not sick. He might have an illness. He's not going to die in the next 6 months. He doesn't have Parkinson's. I don't think he has cancer. And, here we are 2.5 years later, and he's still out there. So yeah, I think it's something I kind of do naturally. And I've been, accused might be a strong word. I've been told that I overanalyze things. So it's just part of my nature. I like to take in as many facts as I can and try to sift through them. It's just, I think that's what any analyst does by nature.
Mm-hmm. I also think it's a very writerly quality. I mean, multiple guests that we've interviewed have talked about overthinking, overanalyzing, gathering, collecting observations about the world around them and kind of storing it for later use. So it seems like you have the perfect intersection of, the analytical mind and the creative mind, where you can kind of distill the facts into fiction, which is brilliant. And I actually want to go back because I think you started to talk about something that I think it's a common struggle with writers, which is having a project, working on it for many years, putting it away, taking it out. Maybe it doesn't sell, switching agents. So you obviously reached a point where it worked because you now have 3 books published. Can you talk a little bit about that moment where it just started to work and you were able to publish your first?
Sure. When I signed with CamCat Books, which is the publisher, it was surreal in terms of, I thought, is this really going to happen? Just because it had been so long, and I think a month or 2 later, COVID started, and I thought, this is never going to work. It's all going to fall apart. And it didn't. And so that that moment, and I know you've both had this too, when you get the first books, shipment of books in the mail, and you open it up and it's your book. It's wild. And even crazier was when I first listened to the audiobook of The Wayward Spy, my first book, and I'm listening to this book and I'm thinking, this is pretty good. I don't remember writing some of these. Did I really write that, or they changed that? That was really surreal. And I recently, I don't know, maybe 6 months ago, listened to The Wayward Target, because I haven't listened to it yet. It's been the same narrator, Erin Bennett. She's fantastic. I listened to it, to the book, and I thought, wow, this is amazing. So it doesn't get old. Yeah. When you get that new book in the mail and you look at it and your name's on it, and you just go, wow.
It's amazing.
It is.
When you're sorry, Liz,
go.
Please.
No, please go.
I was just going to ask, as you are accumulating all of these, incredible stories and these intel, or these bits of intel and all of these kind of things, are you are you consciously cataloging things, thinking in the direction of this would make a great story? Do you find a story and then you end up having this incredible cache of information that you're then able to draw from? Is it does it go in one direction or the other, or is it kind of a mix?
I think it's a mix. So for the first book, I told you I was sitting on Capitol Hill and got the idea about a corrupt congressman and a terrorist plot. And so that actually, that flowed pretty easily. The second book, if you recall, it was in 2004 when Chechen terrorists took over that elementary school in southern Russia and killed hundreds of people. I had kids in elementary school at that time, and it was almost like I was writing about the sum of all my fears. Tom Clancy, the sum of all fears. Yeah. I'm a mom. I have little kids in school. This is like before they started doing security at school and all of that. And it was just sort of a way to, I think, I didn't think this at the time, but in hindsight, because I think I wrote that in about 2007, the second book. So it was 3 years after the fact, but it was in hindsight, with all these years later, I think I was trying to process the horror and this was before a lot of school shootings and that sort of thing. And so that was at the beginning of this book, sort of the anchor event that set it off. Then it came to the third book, The Wayward Target. And I thought, well, what the heck's going to happen? I had no idea what was going to happen. So I said, well, I'll set it a couple years later. So I'll set it in 2000, maybe it was 5 or 6. I can't remember at this point. So I went on the internet and looked up terrorist events in those years so that I would have a historical event to pin the book to. So that in a way that the third book was a little bit more difficult in that regard, because I didn't already know what it was about. Okay. I knew what Maggie's journey was going to be, but I needed all that history and underpinning. And fortunately, I had some characters from the previous books who were a natural fit. It's for the third book, and it's to continue the story. And it's kind of crazy how that happens, because I don't plan it that way when I'm writing the other books, and all of a sudden I'm like, oh, now I know why that character's there, because they're going to show up in the third book. They're going to do bad things. Yeah. So I hope that answered the question. It's a mixture of a process. Sometimes it requires a lot more research, and sometimes it's all up in my head.
Yeah.
Well, it actually dovetails really nicely with the question I was thinking of, which is, given the knowledge you have that I think most Americans don't, just about villains overseas and terroristic acts and, the kind of scary stuff that gets dramatized in movies and books and films about spies and espionage, the real stories. So functioning in the world, as a mom, as a partner, as a family member, how do you do that, knowing that these very real villains exist and these very horrific things happen? I mean, just this week, there was an assassination attempt.
Yeah. And to see my youngest is now 18. And I guess I forgot, like, because like I said at the beginning, I remember Reagan. And I've been worried for RFK Jr. I just think that would be a horrible historical cruelty if something happened to him. And I know he didn't have protection. So when we were watching the news on Saturday, and my son kept going downstairs, popping up to his room to, I don't know, game, whatever, come back down, see what was going on. He's like, my stomach is all messed up. And I said, are you all right? Like, did you get a bug at work? What's going on? He's like, no, it was what happened. And I guess it was upsetting, I think, to most people, but I didn't realize that, my kids were I have two older and then the 18-year-old. The older ones were toddlers, tiny, during 9/11. So they never lived through that. So it's like these two bookends that this is all new for them, really. Political violence and the threats of assassination. I mean, that happens overseas. That doesn't happen here. And it's just different for people of our age because we've lived through several different major events like that. Yeah. But after 9/11, I was like one of those security moms, like you read about. I had all the neighbors, like all the, at the time, my youngest was at preschool, it was the first or second week of school. And when I heard that a second plane had hit, I went right over to my neighbors. I said, get in the car, because her daughter was at the same preschool. We're going to get the kids. And she's like, why? This is in New York. They're small plane. I said, get in the car. It's Al-Qaeda. And she's like, what? It's Al-Qaeda. And because I wasn't at the agency at that point, and I wasn't on Capitol Hill. I was doing some consulting work part-time because I had two little kids. And we went and got the kids, and there was the teacher's like, what are you doing? We're doing, and thankfully the director of the preschool said, no, there's a lot of stuff going on. Any parent who comes there and wants their kid can get their kid and leave. Because we were in the DC area. Nobody knew, you all know, nobody knew what was going to happen next.
Right.
So, I don't lay awake at night. There's a worrying about things. There's a part of me that's glad I'm not in the business anymore. Just because I think, the more the harder it is to put it aside. And I don't live in a bubble, but I try not to obsess over things. I can't get over the thought of what would this week be like if things had turned out different on Saturday for this country. I've been struggling with that a lot this week. It doesn't matter what side you're on, the chaos that would ensue.
Yeah.
It's not something that I don't think we want to go through.
No.
Right.
Well, I would say as maybe the silver lining to that cloud, to hear that your son at the age he is has that sort of empathy where it actually made him feel a physical kind of symptom is almost, I look at it as a positive, because I often wonder, I have nephews who are that age, and friends' kids and things like that. And I often wonder, with this such a polarized, I think, media depiction of what happens a lot, with everything going on, with the way that our political system is sort of set up and is often kind of disseminated to an audience. I feel like the danger is that people just become kind of inured and completely like dissociated almost from that kind of thing. So to hear that is, I guess, maybe it just gives me a little bit of hope for that generation, because I think it's got to be it's really got to be something to be a member of that generation and to now have lived through these last, this last decade, let's say, has to be something. Yeah. So.
Yeah, the COVID kids. And, if there's one thing I wish I could do, if I had a magic wand, it would be, you can't just get your source of information from one news source. You have to get it from at least 4 or 5 across the spectrum, because I think so many people just and it's I think it's, you go with your tribe, your thinking tribe, your whatever. There's a lot more out there, and whether it was better or worse when I was a kid, I feel like it was better. But we weren't saturated with this stuff on every possible level that there is: social, cultural, news. It's just, you almost can't get away from it. And it's really, I think it takes a toll.
Yeah, sure. Well, I wonder too, in connection with that, you mentioned, you grew up the way you grew up. You got your news from the Boston Globe or whatever was on, network news at that time. Do you, having worked behind the scenes, do you look back? Is it possible to look back and say, like, do you think there's a demonstrable difference between the way the news is presented, what those seams are, those gaps, that kind of thing? Is there anything that you kind of...
It wasn't something I thought about as a kid and a young adult.
Right.
But I did have a couple of experiences with the media in my younger career. The first one was when I first worked at the agency. It was during the summer between, I forget which years of college, junior and senior, sophomore and junior. And the New York Times wanted to interview students who were in the student program. And this, there was a CIA minder in the room with us to make sure we didn't say anything classified and all this. And we just talked about our experience and how, I said, nobody at school really knows that I did this and that I'm going to keep doing it. And that's okay. I wasn't told that I couldn't tell people because I wasn't undercover. And then the article came out, and I still have it. And I was like, that's not, I felt like my words were twisted, that, that I was told I couldn't tell anybody. And and I thought, well, that's not really what I said. Why did it come out that way? So I was pretty naive. I think that there was an agenda kind of behind what the journalist was writing, CIA bad automatically kind of view. And then when I was on Capitol Hill, I was at a hearing at another committee. So the Intelligence Committee hearings are 95% classified. So there's no press. But I was at one about something we were following, some sort of scandal brewing or something. So I was at public hearing, and a prominent DC journalist, a print journalist, came up to me and started, I don't know how he knew that I worked for the Intelligence Committee, but he did. And I think some of these DC journalists are a lot like CIA case officers. They spot a subject, they assess whether they might be willing to talk, and then they flatter them. So I was, in my late 20s, relatively green, and he started, about this subject, really trying to work it. And we can go out to dinner and we can do all this stuff. And I was like, I gotta go. I'm not a rule breaker. And I'm thinking, I'm not going to say anything classified to you or anything sensitive. I gotta go. And I went right back to my boss and told him about it. And I was all flustered, and he just thought it was hilarious. He's like, that's what they do. That's their job. So, and it is, I don't hold any animus towards this person. It was just, I just felt like, wow, that was terrifying. So, I think that probably some news organizations or journalists have always had an ideological bent, and they want to kind of prove their case. Right. I think with the advent of cable news, where you have to have something to talk about 24/7 almost, that it's a lot worse than it used to be. And it's fighting through the noise to get to the facts, and then kind of decide that you know what's going on or that you don't know what's going on, and you're going to keep an open mind. Right. That's what being an intelligence analyst really is. When you come in the morning on your computer, they call it traffic. And it's, I think it's based on the old, State Department cables were called traffic. I'm not sure why, but it's called traffic, or it was. And so, it would kind of be like your news feed. nowadays. And you go through it, and you can toss some things that seem irrelevant, and you can pin something that you think's important, and you sift through everything to try to get to the truth, or at least the facts.
Yeah. So that really must then set you up well in your sort of civilian life, we'll say, with being able to sift through a ton of stuff now, especially with the glut, as you said, of information that we have now, unverified sources, dubious kind of channels of information. That must serve you very well, where I think a lot of people really get mired in that.
Yeah, I mean, I try. I'm at least aware that I should. And since Saturday, I've seen all kinds of postings on social media, and I say, well, do you have a source for this? Because I want to find out more. And they'll post like somebody's tweet. Like, that's not a source.
Right.
I need a news source. So I think, well, if so-and-so said it, if it was on the internet, it must be true. So yeah, I don't tend to post about politics anyway. I am very interested in the security situation on Saturday and how that happened. That's just because of the threat to any of our politicians and people. I mean, that could have been somebody with an RPG up there that shot it into the crowd. It wasn't, but these are the places my mind go. So I'm always interested in the security and what are our adversaries learning from things that happen here that they could maybe exploit.
Right. Makes sense.
Right. I actually had a question, Susan, about, given your professional background, you write a book. How does that work when you want to publish a book? Who do you talk to, in the government? Do you have to get a legal read on that? Do you have to get approvals? How does that work since you have access to so much classified information?
I do have to go through the CIA's Publication Review Board. It's got a slightly different name now. I can't remember what it is. And way back in the day, I sent it to them by mail. And the first book, and all I got back was a letter saying that we have no objections. And I sat there thinking, but did you like it? Did you like it? You're supposed to be my first fans. And now you email it to them, and I think it's easier for fiction writers to get through the approval process than if you're writing about the intelligence world on a nonfiction kind of platform. So there was one thing in the first book that I thought maybe I was very careful, because I don't want to reveal any capability that we might have. Like, that's just to sell books. That's just not how it works. But there was one thing that was kind of loosely based off of something I had known way back when, and it went through. So I was like, okay. So yeah, I do a funny story. I'm working on I participated in a group novel by a bunch of some current Intel professionals that were going to be shopping around, where we each wrote a chapter or two, whatever. It was a lot like herding cats. But the woman who finally pulled the whole thing together, there's a technology piece in it. It might be satellites. I can't remember what it is. And her husband, who has never been in the intelligence world, but who's some sort of scientist or engineer, gave her some context or some technology terms to use in that section of the novel. And when it got submitted to the CIA, they blacked all that out. No, it wasn't classified. It must have been close enough to something that they thought this woman, knew. So I thought that was amusing. That was the only part of the book that got redacted by the agency.
Written by the non-agency participant. Incredible. Yeah. Once again, stranger than fiction. Wow.
Yeah. Well, fact is crazier than fiction. So.
And along those lines, with the last couple of minutes we have, I wanted to ask, this did come up that, you did this great panel at Thriller Fest, which was all about spies and espionage. And there were a number of writers from various agencies talking about their books, but there was a question about what are tropes in, spy culture, media, that are just totally tropes that have nothing to do with reality. Are there some that you could think of? Because I thought it was a great question.
Yeah, I mean, I think about it a lot in movies where you get the guys in the van, the unmarked van outside of some government building, and they're like, give me 5 more minutes, I'm almost into the system. And of course, the guards hurrying towards the server room in the building and everybody's panicking. Or when they're like, redirect that satellite over here. 20 years ago, that wasn't a thing. Maybe it is now. I become a little skeptical. So that, and then, I know people love sort of the action hero, super villain genre, and that's great. But I was never going to have Maggie like, oh, there's a gun and mow down a bunch of guys or tackle a bunch of guys. It's just not going to happen. Yeah, the magic gun, the magic weapon, the magic rescue,
right.
It's a trope. They're tropes and they work. But I think, if you're writing more realistic thrillers, that stuff doesn't happen.
Yeah, if you're going full realism, it would just be stacks and stacks of manila folders until everyone's anxiety kicked in.
Exactly. You could crush them under the weight of the paper that you printed.
Nice.
Yeah.
That would be a novel death, at least. I mean, they wouldn't see that one coming.
Well, Susan, I mean, I have 1,001 questions, so we're going to have you back on. You said it sounds like you're working on your standalone right now. Is that? Do you have any kind of timeline on how that's going?
So the first draft is done. And then, of course, as most writers, you look at it and go, what on earth did I just write? This is just trash. And it's not. It's not. But there are certain, I'm going back and forth between, do I have multiple point of views, which means a major rewrite? I know there are some things I need to do to change it before anyone can look at it. But I have, so I got to get my son off to college, and then I feel like I can settle in and get to the edits. And I really like the edits. It's the starting. It's like, well, I only have 2 hours this weekend, so I just might as well play Words with Friends instead of editing.
Tried and tested.
So, this fall, I hope to get it all cleaned up and then get it off to a few beta readers and then send it to my agent and see. So it's a little bit outside of, it's not a spy thriller. And it's not that I don't have ideas for another one. I've had this idea for this sort of political, domestic, psychological thriller. And it's been so much fun because my character in the spy book, Maggie, is the girl next door. She doesn't mess with anybody's mind. And as you know, with the psychological thrillers, it is so much fun to have sort of a unstable narrator and characters and what the heck is going on and just messing with the reader's minds. That's a lot of fun. I didn't know it would be that much fun.
Yeah. It sounds like we may have a convert to the psychological fiction world. I like that.
Yes.
Oh, I read them all the time. Like all the time, including The Woman Inside. I've got to get to the others. But yeah, they're just fun. They're really fun.
They're fun. And I would imagine coming from, having the sort of the psychological, you spending so much time analyzing psychology in your career, that it must be a fun transition to be able to really get into the grid of all that stuff. That's got to be a great time.
Yeah, it's been fun.
Nice. Good. Where can people find you, Susan? Social media, website?
Yeah, I would social media. My website is susanouellette.com. You have to be able to spell my last name, but if you just search The Wayward Spy Susan, you'll find me. I am on Twitter, X, Instagram, Facebook. I think I have a TikTok, but I haven't been on there in 100 years. I don't even know how to do. Oh, you found it. Okay. Yeah. I mean, it's probably been a year since I posted any videos. I find that I might have to hire a 20-year-old to help me. And all of my social media links are on my website.
Right. One final question, just to bring it back to the beginning of the interview. You mentioned those stolen flowers from the garden. Was that ever solved, or is that a cold case to this day?
That is a cold case, and I am ashamed that I did not solve that case.
Well, maybe the three of us get together on a book to bring that one back around. That's what we do.
Or a podcast.
Or a podcast. Yeah, perfect.
Or podcast.
Well, the word is out. If we have any armchair detectives out there who have any leads on this whatsoever, kick us the information and we'll get to work. Susan, thank you for coming on. This was a blast. This was very informative. It was wonderful. Thank you for sharing your wisdom and your passion and everything with us. This was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
I had such a great time. Thank you so much for having me. And let's keep in touch.
Perfect. Sounds great.
Definitely.
All right. Imposter Hour with Liz and Greg. Thank you very much. Imposter Hour with Liz and Greg is created and hosted by us, Elizabeth Keenan and Greg Wands. The show is produced and edited by Kate Herget, who started the Book Wild Collective with her podcasts Between the Lines and her thriller podcast, Killing the Tea. Our original theme music was composed by Scott Leeds, and our logo was designed by Steve Luoma.
And you can find us on Instagram at Imposter Hour Podcast and online at imposterhour.com. Thanks for tuning in.